Israel's proposed ground offensive in Rafah, which aims to trap Palestinians inside and eradicate all life, is a matter that has the potential to alter history significantly. Despite the International Court of Justice's verdict urging Israel to refrain from acts of genocide, it appears that Israel and its supporters are indifferent to this ruling and are comfortable with their planned course of action. However, South Africa is determined to prevent such a catastrophic event from occurring, no matter the lengths it has to go or the actions it must take. Once again, South Africa has appealed to the International Court of Justice, seeking immediate intervention to avert the massive loss of life among the 1.4 million Palestinians residing in Rafah. Until now, Rafah has served as the last safe haven for the people of Palestine in Gaza, but Israel's plan threatens to obliterate it entirely. To avoid this impending catastrophe, South Africa has taken decisive steps. The international community, including even Israel's allies, expressed shock when Israel unveiled its intentions for a ground offensive in Rafah, effectively signifying that Israeli troops would enter the area with the intent to eliminate every single resident. This poses a grave dilemma for the Palestinians in Rafah as they face the heart-wrenching decision of whether to flee their final refuge in Gaza. The situation in Rafah is rapidly deteriorating, prompting the United Nations aid chief to issue a stark warning about the potential for a brutal slaughter and massacre. The aid chief implored Israel to heed the warnings from the international community, emphasizing that disregarding these warnings would be harshly judged by history. Numerous countries and international organizations are urgently appealing to Israel to reconsider its planned offensive, with Ireland's Leo Varadkar accusing Israel of being consumed by anger. The gravity of the situation calls for a collective effort to avert the impending tragedy and seek a peaceful resolution. For weeks, Israel has been carrying out relentless bombings in Rafah and continues to intensify its efforts, viewing a ground offensive as the only viable option to counter Hamas. However, this prospect has left the Palestinians in Rafah feeling anxious and uncertain about their next course of action. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed the military to plan for the evacuation of the population from Rafah, citing the imminent entry of the Israel Defense Forces into Hamas's final stronghold. The IDF aims to devise an evacuation strategy that ensures the safety of civilians, while distinguishing between civilians and Hamas militants, as communicated by spokesperson Lerner. However, the plan has not yet been presented to the government. It is important to note that more than 1.4 million people are currently residing in a sprawling tent city along the Egyptian border in Rafah, serving as the sole refuge for Palestinians fleeing the northern and central areas of Gaza. These families are already grappling with severe shortages of essential supplies and live under constant threat from Israeli airstrikes. In this precarious situation, Israel intends to evacuate Rafah. However, it is expected to be an immensely challenging task for the 1.4 million individuals hailing from various parts of Gaza to find a safe new home and leave Rafah once again. Unfortunately, Israel may use this situation as an excuse, labeling them as Hamas sympathizers and subjecting them to targeted killings. The residents of Rafah now face a heart-wrenching choice: either remain in the city and risk being trapped in a violent Israeli ground offensive, or attempt to flee to towns ravaged by Israeli bombings, where surviving inhabitants report resorting to desperate measures to stay alive. It is crucial to understand the immense suffering endured by the Palestinians in Rafah, who have faced displacement, disease, and starvation during months of turmoil, as highlighted by UN Representative Griffiths in a recent statement. Their plight raises a pressing question: where can they find safety when there is nowhere left in Gaza? Numerous international entities, including the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and an increasing number of countries such as the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, have expressed concerns about the potential impact of a ground offensive on the civilian population. However, these concerns have thus far remained confined to words alone. China has called on Israel to cease its military operations, emphasizing the need to take every possible measure to prevent civilian casualties. A spokesperson from the Chinese Foreign Ministry has stated their opposition and condemnation of acts that harm civilians and violate international law. Italy's Foreign Minister, Antonio Tajani, has criticized Israel's response to Hamas as disproportionate, expressing alarm over the high number of Palestinian civilian casualties. During a White House visit, Jordan's King Abdullah warned of the devastation that a ground operation in Rafah would cause, emphasizing the urgency of preventing an Israeli attack on the area. The Prime Minister of Ireland has strongly denounced Israel's actions, asserting that it is evident that Israel is not heeding any country's advice. He has expressed grave concern about the risk of a massacre in Rafah and criticized Israel for being driven by uncontrolled anger. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, has announced an active investigation into any alleged crimes committed by Israel, expressing deep concern over the reported bombardment and the possibility of a ground attack in Rafah. However, it is widely acknowledged that meaningful change requires the involvement of South Africa in the resistance against the offensive in Rafah. Consequently, South Africa has decided to once again bring Israel before the International Court of Justice, holding it accountable for its malevolent plans. South Africa has described Rafah as the last sanctuary for the surviving people in Gaza, and argues that Israel's offensive there would flagrantly violate the Genocide Convention and the previous ruling of the ICJ, which mandates Israel to take all necessary measures to prevent genocide in Gaza. Consequently, South Africa has filed a second appeal with the International Court of Justice, urgently seeking to halt Israel's military operations against Hamas and Gaza. The appeal specifically calls on the court to instruct Israel to refrain from launching an imminent attack on Hamas forces in Rafah, the southernmost city of the enclave. The IDF justifies its assault on the predominantly intact Hamas battalion stationed in Rafah along the Gaza-Egypt border. However, it is disconcerting that the IDF is disregarding the massive population of 1.4 million Palestinians residing in Rafah, who will bear the direct consequences of this offensive. These consequences include death, bombings, capture, torture, and being treated as Hamas militants. Israel alleges the presence of senior Hamas leaders and Israeli hostages within Rafah or within Hamas's subterranean military tunnel network beneath the city. However, this claim remains unproven, yet Israel is prepared to proceed with the offensive. Experts anticipate that the same pattern will unfold. Israel will attack Rafah, causing destruction and the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. Subsequently, Israel may attempt to plant evidence to support the claim of Hamas' presence. Alternatively, Israel may shamelessly deny Hamas's presence in Rafah, as it did in the case of Al-Shifa Hospital. On Tuesday, South Africa's presidency announced that the government has urgently petitioned the ICJ to assess whether Israel's decision to extend military activities in Rafah violates Palestinian rights. In response, Israel criticized South Africa, accusing it of acting as the legal arm of Hamas through its ICJ application. Israel also highlighted perceived double standards, questioning South Africa's failure to address other alleged war crimes committed by the Assad regime in Syria and the Houthis in Yemen. However, this criticism implies that Israel implicitly acknowledges its own genocidal actions. The concern raised is why South Africa addresses genocide committed by Israel, but not by other states. While the ICJ has yet to rule on South Africa's central claim of genocide in Gaza, it has recognized the Palestinians' right to protection against genocidal acts. Historically, the ICJ has granted additional emergency measures when circumstances on the ground have changed. The devastation in Gaza is severe, with approximately 80% of the population displaced and a humanitarian crisis pushing a quarter of Palestinians towards starvation. Despite this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu remains indifferent to Palestinian suffering and persists in his pursuit of total victory. However, South Africa is determined not to allow Israel to exploit loopholes and endanger the lives of 1.4 million Palestinians. The South African government is deeply concerned about Israel's ongoing military offensive in Rafah, which has already resulted in significant loss of life, injuries, and destruction. South Africa does not want to be remembered as a country that idly witnessed the slaughter of 1.4 million people. In its recent submission to the ICJ, South Africa expressed distress over the situation and emphasized the urgency of addressing it, particularly given the daily death toll in Gaza. The ICJ has confirmed receiving South Africa's new request without providing further comments on the next steps. However, a ruling could be expected within weeks if the court decides to convene another hearing on additional provisional measures. Israel vehemently denies accusations of genocide in Gaza and argues that its actions are aimed at targeting Hamas militants while sparing civilians. Israel claims that the embedding of Hamas within civilian areas complicates efforts to avoid civilian casualties. However, this argument cannot justify a ground offensive in a civilian area. Israel justifies its actions as a response to the attacks in southern Israel on October 7th, with the goal of dismantling Hamas. However, South Africa accuses Israel of disregarding the court's preliminary ruling by persisting in targeting civilians. Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor has stated that Israel perceives unchecked authority due to South Africa challenging Israel's every action and future plans. The international community is now questioning Israel's actions, and even US President Joe Biden has criticized Israel's military assault in Gaza as excessive. President Biden emphasizes the need for a credible and executable plan to protect civilians if Israel continues with further operations against Hamas and Rafah. The actions that the ICJ will take regarding South Africa's latest request remain to be seen, as Israel continues to violate earlier orders and shows no signs of avoiding genocide.